Hello and welcome back to Bicycle Legs and another edition of Bicycle Legs Discovers the Rush. And today I have another wonderful guest from the Rush fans community, Mr. Ryder Hyduk. Ryder, thank you so much for doing the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. Super excited to be here.
Ryder, I'll get you to tell my viewers a little which album that you've chosen out for me, a little bit behind that album, and most importantly, why you wanted to discuss this album with me.
All right. So the album we're going to be talking about today is My Favorite Headache by Geddy Lee. This is Geddy Lee's only solo album. And it's a little interesting as it stands out as one of the few solo statements within the Rush lineage. In the late 90s, following the personal tragedies that happened in Neil Peart's life, it left Rush in a kind of state of limbo. Not no pun intended from their previous album at the time, but it kind of left Geddy and Alex kind of up in the air of what they were going to do at the time. So it led Geddy to meet up with Ben Mink, who is a frequent collaborator. He actually provided the violin on Losing It from Signals. And they got together to just play, work on some songs, and they found a real connection in their musicianship, which eventually led them to create this album right here together, My Favorite Headache, which is just packed with a ton of really great tracks, ton of really great names on this too. Matt Cameron from Soundgarden, I'm pretty sure, I think that's his name, features on some of the drums on this. And it just serves as this really interesting piece in Rush history and kind of shows, kind of in a bubble, what Geddy Lee, in a sense, brought to Rush. There's a lot of really interesting musical things in this that you can pick out and kind of tell, like, oh, that's like, it's such a core like part of the Rush sound, and you can hear that Geddy is like such a huge part of it, obviously through his bass lines, but I feel like through some of the songwriting it kind of keys you in on what kind of a songwriter he is, separated from Alex and Neil. So this is a really really great album, and I'm super excited to talk about this.
Yeah. So yeah, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? I mean, I've read a little bit about this album, and I've read that Geddy wasn't necessarily super keen to do a solo album. Like he felt like his musical um like ambitions and that sort of thing were well sort of expressed in Rush itself. Um, but as you say, there was that sort of uncertainty. We didn't know if there was going to be a band going forward and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's an interesting album. So let's go through it track by track, and it starts with the title track, My Favorite Headache, which starts off with this really sort of aggressive bass riff, and it's got these dissonant guitars going on. It's a great way to start an album. It really sort of, it doesn't lull you into any sort of false sense of security. It just wakes you up right at the beginning there, doesn't it? Um, it has a sort of a prog metal vibe, this song does, to me anyway. The lyric, I feel like, is a bit Neil Pearty. I could imagine Neil having
Hmm.
written this lyric. Um, and then, of course, it does the thing that a lot of Rush music does, where it switches from double time to half time when it goes into the second section. Um, and then it heads back into that sort of prog metal groove. Um, I think the strings are used really, really well on this song. Um, I probably like this song actually better than some of the songs on the two Rush albums before this or the two Rush albums after this. Um, which I've got to admit, I like those albums, but they're not sort of top tier Rush for me anyway. Those sort of late
Hmm.
90s, early 2000s Rush albums. Um, it definitely has, but it definitely does have that sort of latter day Rush feel to it, this song. It could have fit onto one of those, especially that sort of Test for Echo or Vapor Trails. I think it could have fit quite well onto either of those albums.
Oh, for sure. It definitely has that like late 90s, not necessarily that it's grungy, but just like how filthy like the bass riff is. Like it definitely feels like something that could have been slotted in on like Test for Echo counterparts, or you could even make the case for Vapor Trails. There it's super dense arrangement. I believe in an interview, Geddy said that some of the guitars that you hear in the intro aren't actually guitars. They're just basses run through guitar riffs. So a couple of, as that intro riff is building up, a couple of those sounds in there aren't guitar.
Hmm.
And you know, as it I what you said about the string arrangements, definitely that's going to be something of note throughout the album. The string arrangements, which I think were largely provided by Ben Mink, are fantastic and really accompany the songs great.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's probably one of I don't want to spoil sort of the rest of the album, but I do think that My Favorite Headache's probably one of the strongest tracks on the album. So
For
it gets
sure.
the album off to a great start. Then we get the present tense. This sort of the lyric to me is about, how only living in the present, not thinking about the past, not thinking about the future can be limiting, you know, that you sort of need to broaden your vision, as it were. Um, it's up tempo, but it's less intense than the title track. It has that alternative rock feel that sort of later Rush had a lot. Um, there's some nice bass chords in part. I always love it when Geddy plays bass chords.
Mm,
It's one of my favorite sort of Rush things. Um, Ben Mink and Matt Cameron, I do have to say that, Ben Mink plays sort of the guitars or most of the guitars. Geddy plays some of them. Matt Cameron plays drums, I think, on all but one track.
hmm
They're good players, but I do miss the musicality of Neil and Alex a little bit on a song like this. You know, I could have really sort of used, some Neil or Alex flourishes on this song, as it were.
Yeah, that's one thing that is a little, it's kind of interesting coming from Rush albums going into this one, is there are some tracks on this one that they still have a lot of the driving power that Rush has, but I guess the intricacy of some of the songs is just a little off. Like, not that they're off, but it leans more into straightforward rocker territory. That's kind of where I say a little bit more like the 90s grunge kind of feel. Like it
Yeah.
focuses more on just like solid hooks, solid riffs. And even though there is still some really like intricate like stuff that comes in, especially a little bit later into the album, there are some tracks on this, like especially the present tense, that just lean into just a nasty guitar riff and just go straight ahead instead of going into, a bunch of different sections and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Then we get Window to the World. This is sort of a mid-tempo song. It's got some acoustic as well as electric guitars on it. It's a simpler lyric than contemporary Rush, but it's still a good lyric. I really like it. Um, there's some keyboard pads in the background. Uh, no Alex means no real guitar solos on this album, I've noticed. There are a couple of little sort of bits where the guitar is a little more prominent, but there are no sort of, big, long lyrical solos, as it were. Um, but then again, as I've mentioned in the show that I did on Vapor Trails, there are no guitar solos either. So, I mean, maybe that's just a way the band were going to go for a little bit anyway. So,
Yeah. I love the that really like old almost toy sounding keyboard that's going through the background of the whole song. I've always found that it's just like a super cool like no other like Rush related song sounds like that. It just is such a cool little like musical idea that they had run through the track.
mm,
But I really like the simpler lyric in this song. It kind of gives me not necessarily like half the world vibes and that it's just half the world repeating over and over again,
mm,
but it's just going back to like a simpler refrain and things like that. But I like the lyrics just kind of are they're a little like inspiring like what is the world like, let's go out, look at all these different things, it's just another really great just like solid rocker at the start of the album.
yeah. That's the interesting thing I find with this album too, as we go through the rest of the tracks. Obviously, Rush had possibly one of the greatest lyricists in Neil Peart. I've really come to appreciate him as a lyricist. Geddy shows on this album that he's no slouch with the lyrics either. You
Oh, for
know,
sure.
maybe not quite up to Neil's standard, but he still writes very good lyrics. He writes a lot better lyrics than a lot of his contemporaries. That's what I will say.
Yeah. I mean, he started off the album with one man standing on the plains of Abraham. Like
Yeah.
I thought surely Neil had a credit somewhere on the album, but that's some those are some pretty nice words for a bass player. I'll have to say so myself.
Yeah.
Um, especially and I guess kind of to transition into the next song a little bit.
Yeah.
The lyrics on the next song, Working It Perfect, I am such a huge fan of this song. I think since My Favorite Headache, it's probably my next favorite song on the album. Super, super cool just music behind it. I love the like kind of distorted like I don't know if it's necessarily percussion, but whatever the like electronic sound is in the background adds in a super cool like driving quality and backs the drums in a really unique way.
Yeah.
Geddy Lee is at the top of his game with his vocals on this track. I love him in the verses here. And just I love how the song just kind of transitions through the slower bits too.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and once the strings come in at the end and kind of build up the choruses, like it's just such a cool moment.
I was going to ask you too, working at Perfect, do you know why he spelt it with a K?
I am not 100% sure. I was trying to look around. I couldn't find anything exactly. But it's kind of interesting. I don't know right off the top of my head what the whole reason behind that is. I wonder
Okay.
if it's like an aesthetic purpose or if there's something a little bit more behind it.
Yeah. I've got to say, with this song, it feels very late 90s, early 2000s Rush to me. Maybe a little less sort of distorted in the guitars, but and that's sort of like a recurring theme, I think, on this album. Geddy's getting into his higher range on this song too, which I like to hear it in the sort of latter period Rush when he starts sort of getting into that higher range a bit because he didn't do it nearly as much in that sort of latter period Rush. The lyric is about sort of the unrealistic idea of striving for perfection. And I agree with you. It's a really good lyric. It's one of my favorites on the album. It's mid-tempo and sort of musically straightforward, but the strings definitely add extra interest for me. It's the sort of thing you're not really getting on a Rush album, those sort of string arrangements and that sort of thing. There's some nice piano from Geddy too. Uh, and I really wanted to particularly point out the lyric, um, success to failure is a matter of degrees. I found that lyric very poignant, that line. And there's almost a guitar solo at the end, but not quite. Yeah, it's definitely one of the better tracks on the album. I agree with you. And then we get Runaway Train, which is another sort of crunchy alternative rocker. Uh, the verses are in 6/4, and I love when Rush use sort of different time signatures and that sort of thing. And I particularly like 6/4 as a time signature. I feel like it gives a song a sense of momentum.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Um, the lyric is sort of about fighting back against depression, which again, great lyric. Really love that sort of topic. I like the quiet to loud dynamics of this song. You'll get loud part and quiet part and that sort of thing. It's a simple song despite the non-standard time signature. And again, very late period Rush sounding, as I mentioned in my notes again, albeit less distorted than some of that sort of late period Rush.
Yeah, I once again the little electronics that they have going on in the background, like throughout the verses, I love how it kind of dynamically like carries it through the drums kind of getting bigger. But yeah, just another really solid song. I don't have necessarily a ton to say about this one,
Yeah, yeah.
which is a little that is kind of one thing that kind of holds the record back a little bit is by the nature of some of these songs being a little simpler and not necessarily as musically complex. I feel like sometimes these songs for me didn't necessarily jump out. Like this is a song for me that took a while for me to really like get it and get why it's on the album and to get into it. Not necessarily because I was expecting more out of it, but it was just like, this is just once again another like straightforward rocker on the album.
Yeah. No, I like the song quite a bit, but yeah, it may be
Hmm.
not as good as some of the other songs, but I still think it works well. And then we get the Angels Share. And this is our first ballad of the album. It's sort of halfway through the album. People who've been watching this series regularly will know I've had a very mixed record when it comes to Rush ballads. Some of them I've quite liked, some of them have been, for me, the weakest songs on the album. I wouldn't say that about this one, though. The lyric seems to be sort of a struggle between the spiritual and a naturalistic worldview. Again, a very Neil sort of topic, I think.
Yeah.
Um, it's definitely not, as I say, it's definitely not as bad as some Rush ballads for me, but it's not as good as some of the others either. Geddy's vocals are great throughout this album, and this song's no exception. I think he sings very tenderly in parts on this song, which I really, really like. This is definitely a singer's album rather than a virtuoso player's album, you know.
Hmm.
I think the fact that Neil and Alex aren't there, and you've got Ben Mink and Matt Cameron, you know, it gives the dynamic of this album a little bit of a different feel. Not better, not worse, just different. Um, and I think, that's a good thing. I think, you know, although this does definitely have a similar sound to that sort of late 90s, early 2000s Rush, it's got a bit of a difference as well. And I think you want that from a solo album, don't you? You don't want it, to be a Rush album, as it were.
Oh, 100%. And that's one thing that I came to appreciate with this album in time was not just, Geddy Lee's contributions to it, what the undeniable influence that Ben Mink has on the music. This song really shows his string work at the top of his game here. I love the string arrangements in this. Love, love, love them. I think they back up the bass and all the like different bass chords that he's playing super well. But yeah, like this album and it existing in a different musical context than Rush, where it's mainly like Geddy, Ben Mink, Matt Cameron playing drums on most of it, and then you have some other musicians coming in here and there. It's such a cool, like interesting, like little bit of Rush history that kind of just stands on its own and offers like a different flavor of it, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So then we get into the second half of the album. Got the song "Moving to Bohemia," and this song to me is a sort of a more light-hearted lyric. It's kind of a playful lyric in some ways, I think, which again Rush would do occasionally. I mean, it's
Hmm.
not quite the same, but I got a little bit of a flash when I was listening to sort of reading the lyric through this song when I was listening to the album. I got a little bit of a flash to a song like, say, A Passage to Bangkok, you know,
Hmm. Yeah.
that idea of, a light-hearted sort of travelogue, as it were. And musically, it uses different time signatures again in the verses, which I like. It sort of like has a bar of 6/4 and then a bar of 7/4. Um, you know, keeps it really interesting, and it does that sort of double time, half time Rush trick again, which again, I'm a sucker for that when they do that. So um I think it's well sequenced in the album, and I will say that about this album too. I think the album, generally speaking, is very well sequenced. It has a good flow. It doesn't have too many of one kind of song in all together, and then that sort of thing. It mixes it up really, really well. And again,
Hmm.
on this song, some really evocative strings from Ben Mink. Love them.
Yeah. I love the that halftime chorus, that I had a dream of a different place. That whole section is really, really great. Um, and in the verses, I love Geddy Lee's just like super fast, like flamenco bass playing. Just it's a really fun song. This is one that admittedly, like, I heard the lyric and I'm like, you don't have to cut the lawn. Like, what are we talking about? But I chewed on it a little bit more, and admittedly, I really, really like this song.
Yeah. And then we get Home on the Strange. Um, I would love to know if this song is about somebody or based on somebody because, there's the line, things like he's a Canadian icon and things like that. And it started making me think, is Geddy sort of referencing somebody he knows here or something like that? I don't know if you've got any insight into that at all, but
I'm not sure. It'd be really funny if he wrote it about Alex or somebody like that. It seems like something. Yeah, he don't like to sleep with his clothes on. I'm sure Alex doesn't, but
yeah,
yeah, this is a really cool one. This has Jeremy Taggart on drums. If I'm not mistaken, this was recorded on one of the last days of sessions for this album. Matt Cameron wasn't in the studio either. He was done recording for his album or just wasn't able to come in. They recorded the bass and the drums at the same time, and we're just like, all right, it's a jam. Let's just throw this on the album. And I really, really like this song. This is another one of my favorites on here.
yeah,
The
absolutely.
bass riff is just undeniable. Like this is like a Geddy Lee, like up there, one of my favorite riffs. And then just super driving groove, really cool lyrics, and it's just another great song.
Yeah,
It's starting to close out the album in a really strong way, and I'm really
yeah,
liking like how it leads into the end of it.
absolutely. I felt musically it gets a bit funky. Um,
Oh yeah.
I feel like Geddy's bass playing is probably more prominent on this song than it has been since the opener, My Favorite Headache. Because as I was
Hmm.
saying earlier, this is much more of a singer's album, but here his bass playing's really to the fore, which I really
Yeah.
like. It's an interesting character study, and the music lives up to the lyric, I think. The sort of slightly odd person that he's talking about in this lyric, and you get the sort of music to match that. Um, this or the title track, I think, are probably my favorites on the album. It's a
Hmm.
toss-up between those two for me.
Yeah. Before we get into the next song, just to
Yep.
go back to something that you said earlier, how it's a little bit more of a singer's album, and this is one of the songs where Geddy is really upfront. Um, there is, I think, a massive degree of respect that needs to be handed to Geddy Lee for not just like making every song have a super nasty bass riff and be super upfront. Like he is really focused on the super tight songwriting here. And even though like you could look at it as, oh, it's very easy for you to see like a Geddy Lee album on the shelf and be like, oh, there's going to be all these nasty bass riffs and he's going to be singing super up high and all that. But he shows just an enormous amount of restraint as a musician and just makes these songs like as good as possible without needing a super upfront driving bass riff or all these crazy vocals. Like he knows when to use those effectively. And I think this is an example. Home on the Strange is a really great example of him like using a very strong bass line, but you look at songs like Angels Share that came right before it where it's like he's doing a little bit more like chordal stuff and he's kind of sitting in the background and letting the strings kind of take the lead in there. I guess that's kind of like the main idea I get like out of that
Yeah.
song. But yeah, just huge respect to Geddy Lee as a musician for like having that restraint.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what I would compare that with is
Hmm.
Chris Squire's Fish Out of Water.
Yes, yes. Fantastic album.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful album. But again, Chris Squire, one of the great bass players of all time. But on that album, his bass playing's definitely there and you can definitely hear it and that sort of thing. But it's a song album, it's about
Yes.
Chris's songwriting. And I feel the same way with this, with Geddy, that this album is about the songwriting and that sort of thing. So I mean, musically they're very different because Chris Squire's album is
Hmm.
obviously very much a progressive rock album. But
Yeah.
just the idea that these albums are about the songs, they're not about the chops and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, you
So,
look at us the last song on that Chris Squire album, not to get too far from Getty, is that
mm,
Safe Canon song. Most of that song is the orchestra that's playing there.
yeah,
So, and he's still there, but that's kind of the main upfront thing.
yeah, absolutely. So then we get the song Slipping, which is the second ballad on the album. It's got a really nice piano intro from Geddy. It's a song about feeling like you're falling short in communication in a relationship. Again, something that Neil was sort of, that sort of lyric was something that Neil was doing in that late 90s, early aughts. It's very relatable. And Geddy's lyric doesn't get cliched, which, it would be a very easy thing to do in a relationship song. It's probably the better of the two ballads for mine. It's musically uncomplicated, but it's not simplistic, and that's a fine line to balance as well.
Hmm. Yeah, this one is another really strong ballad. I love the just the refrain that I slipped along the way. I just love the
Mm.
harmonies in there. And the piano is amazing. I love the piano in this song and for the rest of the album too. It's really great to have like upfront piano, especially when, if you think about where Rush is, Test for Echo and Vapor Trails had no keyboards on it at all.
Mm.
So to have an album where Geddy Lee is also up front playing piano is also really cool.
Yeah, but and I mean again, sort of comparing with Rush albums, even Rush albums that had keyboards on them didn't tend to have piano. It was mostly
Yeah.
synthesizers.
Hmm.
So so then we get Still, which is sort of a mid-tempo song. It's again got that sort of blend of acoustic and electric guitar. It's a song about persistence in the face of challenges. Again, you know, a very Rush sort of theme, lyrically, I think. This one, I do have to say, it's a nice song, but it doesn't stand out for me as much as some of the other songs on the album. Um, Maybe I need to give it a little bit more time. I've only had, sort of 4 or 5 listens to the album before I do these shows. So, I always I'm going to be interested with the whole Rush canon, how I go with, going back and having repeated listens and all that sort of thing. Because I do intend sometime after this series finishes to do a ranking of the catalog. So I'll
Ooh.
really immerse myself in the albums again when I do that. But yeah, this one's not my favorite song on the album, but it's still good. I do like it. And I do like some of the sort of synth sounds in the background of this one, giving it a little bit of texture.
Yeah, this is another one where kind of like Runaway Train, especially coming up after Slipping, I felt like, you go Home on the Strange, you're all the way up here, like energy wise. Slipping brings it down a little bit, but it's still a little like more up tempo, I guess. But then still brings it down a little bit further. And especially knowing that Grace to Grace is coming up on like the next song on the album, and not to spoil that one, but the energy in relation to Still is all the way up here. It was kind of like this was an interesting one for me at first. I still think it's really solid, but I do agree with you. I think it's not necessarily my favorite one on this album.
Yeah. So then we do get the album closer, which is Grace to Grace. And I'm just wondering at the moment, because I have a cat named Grace, so I'm wondering if she's going to come running out and join us for this. But yeah, this is an up-tempo album closer, again with that sort of alternative rock feel. I love the quiet choruses. You have these big bombastic verses, and then you get these really quiet choruses, which I really like. I have to admit, I really like the sound of Geddy's lyric, but I'm not entirely sure what he's talking about in this lyric. It's a little bit cryptic to me. Again, I've only had a few listens, so maybe I need to sort of spend a bit more time to get the meaning of it. But it's one of those lyrics where even when I don't necessarily know the literal meaning of the song, I still like the poetry of the lyric. It's a rousing end, I think, and a really, it's a rousing end to what's a really good solo album from Geddy.
100%. So this song, the lyrics were actually written about Geddy Lee's parents' experiences in the Holocaust,
Oh,
in like the
okay.
same vein as Red Sector A from Grace Under Pressure. So this is interesting as it's it's a more first person, I guess, or closer to the source perspective on Holocaust events than Red Sector A was because that was written through Neil. I think the lyrics are really, really great. And this song is just, it is so I just can't explain it. It's just amazing. I got to talk to Ben Mank when we were doing the Rush Deep Dive series on RushFans. And I told him I think it's genuinely unfair that you can have a song this good close out your album. Like it is just it cranks it all the way up to 11. Everybody's at the top of their game. I love the dynamics between the verses and the slower choruses. But even in the verses, how halfway through there's just a little riff, and then after that, it just the verses build up even higher. I love the little like I don't necessarily know if it's a guitar solo. Once again, another maybe guitar solo on this album, but towards the end, I love Ben Mink's guitar on this one. And to give him credit for the rest of the album, he was on fire on the guitar throughout the whole thing. Matt Cameron, I love the drums here. Another super great driving beat and backs up the bass super well. And I'll say it again. I think it's unfair that you can have an album or a song this good close out your album. It's such a great song, and it displays everybody that was involved with it at the absolute top of their game.
Yeah. Well, again, it sort of shows how well sequenced the album is, like I was mentioning earlier, I think. They
Hmm.
really put a lot of care into sort of arranging these 11 songs into a flow, into a whole album. I've got to say, overall, Geddy does a really good job. He strays a little bit away from the Rush sound, but not too far. Maybe if I had one criticism of the album is maybe I would have liked to have seen him push that a little further, like a little bit, go a little bit more outside of the sort of Rush oeuvre, as it were. But that's a very minor quibble. Overall, it's a really good album. And I've got to say, I probably like this album better than Counterparts, Test for Echo, Vapor Trails, or Snakes and Arrows. Not that I don't dislike those albums. I like those albums quite a bit, but I think this is a better album than any of those. But that's again just my opinion based on my initial listenings to the album.
Yeah, there's a lot of maybe not a lot of, but there's some Rush albums that I would put them underneath this. Like if I was going to rank them all
Hmm.
together, I think that this album it's very different from what Rush was offering at the time. There is still a lot that Rush fans can enjoy and a lot of things they'll be able to like point out and identify as like a very like core Rush characteristic. But it's so uniquely Getty, and you can hear like so much of like what he as like a unique musician like in that time was willing to bring to the table. And honestly, I think there is a good bit of experimentation on this album, especially with the use of like electronics, some of the keyboards on this one. I feel like they kind of lean into some just newer recording technologies and stuff, and I love to see Getty like innovating. And honestly, I feel like this album was a very much needed thing for Geddy, because I feel like him getting out of the musical context of Rush for a little bit. Admittedly, for as much as I like Test for Echo, I'm kind of notorious on Rush fans for being a Test for Echo defender. I will admit that it was at a point in Rush's career where they were a little bit conflicted on songwriting. And I feel like getting Geddy Lee out of his comfort zone, getting him in with Ben Mank, another songwriter that he's very comfortable with, and getting him in the studio with people like Matt Cameron and other amazing musicians, I think really it gave him the kind of wherewithal, because he stated before that he never had a great desire to make an individual statement. That's what he said about kind of like his thoughts behind his solo album. He's like, I never had a desire to make a statement. I satisfy so much of my musical self within the context of Rush. But it's just super cool to see him out and about working with other people to get him out of his comfort zone. And I think it very much helped them in the long run with albums like Vapor Trails and Snakes and Arrows, because you can start to hear things that he does on this album, like his vocal layering, chordal bass playing, especially, is so huge on Vapor Trails and Snakes and Arrows. You can hear all those different things start to influence Rush music later on. So it's just another really great album within this huge family tree of music.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Ryder, for introducing me to this album. I will leave links in the description as I do whenever I have one of these wonderful Rush fans people on the channel. I will leave links to Rush fans' various projects, YouTube, Instagram, etc. So please do go and check those out if you're not already following those. Please do like, share, and subscribe here. It really does help the channel out. If you're new to the channel, please go and have a look at some of my other videos. I have everything playlisted, so if you want to see some of my other Bicycle Legs Discovers Rush episodes, I have a playlist for those. If you want to see some of my studio albums ranked shows, I have a playlist for those. And if you want to see my appearances on other people's channels, I also have a playlist for those. If you want to follow me on social media, I'm at Bicycle Legs on Instagram, Twitter, and a bunch of other places. I also have a dedicated Bicycle Legs Facebook page. Links are all in the doobly-doo. Please do give those all a follow and join in the conversation. I'd really love to have you there. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.